This is what happens when faith becomes the only thing keeping a dying ship alive. I remember the first time I felt the weight of the void pressing against my skull, not as a physical sensation but as an absence so profound it became its own presence, and I understood then that the darkness between stars was not empty, but filled with the patient hunger of eternity waiting to claim us all. My name is Rethvaros, and I have served aboard the Emperor's warships for 23 years without once setting foot on solid ground, without once breathing air that was not recycled through ancient filtration systems that groaned like dying men, without once feeling sunlight that was not filtered through armor-glass viewports streaked with the residue of 1,000 engagements. I am a lieutenant commander of the Imperial Navy, 6th officer aboard the lunar-class cruiser Indomitable Wrath, and I have watched more men die than I have spoken to in all my years of service. This is not a story of heroism. This is not a tale of glory won in the Emperor's name. This is the accounting of how faith becomes a blade turned inward, how duty transforms into a slow poison, and how the void claims you piece by piece until nothing remains but the shell that continues to follow orders. The Indomitable Wrath left dock at Baca Orbital 47 Standard years ago on what was classified as a routine patrol along the Segmentum Tempestus fringe territories, a deployment expected to last perhaps 5 years before rotation back to port for refit and crew exchange. I was not part of the original complement. I came aboard during the 3rd year, transferred from a system defense monitor after my previous vessel suffered catastrophic reactor failure during what was officially recorded as a training exercise. 17 of us survived that incident. 3 made it through the interrogation that followed. I learned then that survival was not always rewarded, that living when others died required explanation, justification, and sometimes sacrifice of a different kind. The cruiser was already showing signs of extended deployment when I arrived via shuttle, its hull scarred by weapons, fire, and micrometeor impacts that had not been properly repaired, its running lights flickering with power fluctuations that maintenance crews attributed to worn conduits they could not replace without supplies that never came. The shuttle bay smelled of promethium and unwashed bodies, a scent that would become so familiar I would cease to notice it within weeks. The deck plating thrummed with vibrations from the plasma drives, a constant reminder that we existed within a machine that could fail at any moment, that our lives depended on systems maintained by exhausted tech priests and servitors whose machine components were cannibalizing parts from each other to keep functioning. Captain Mordecai presided over the ship with the absolute authority granted to Void commanders, a lean man whose face had been reconstructed after Void exposure during a boarding action, leaving him with features that never quite matched, as though 2 different men had been sutured together. He addressed the new transfers in the main assembly hall, a cavernous space lined with Aquila symbols and purity seals that fluttered in the recycled air. His voice carried through voxcasters with a metallic edge that made every word sound like a threat. He told us we were the Emperor's chosen, that our service aboard the Indomitable Wrath was the highest calling a mortal could aspire to, that every moment we spent in the void brought us closer to the divine perfection of duty fulfilled. He told us that shore leave was a luxury reserved for those who had not yet proven their worth, that the men and women aboard this vessel had transcended such base needs through their unwavering faith. He told us that we should expect nothing from the Imperium except the opportunity to die in service, and that we should consider ourselves blessed for every day we drew breath in the Emperor's fleet. I believed him then. The reality of void service reveals itself slowly, like frostbite creeping through extremities until the damage is already irreversible. The ship ran on 3 watches that cycled every 8 hours, meaning you were always either working, sleeping, or preparing for one or the other. There was no variation in this routine. No rest days, no celebrations beyond the mandatory observances of imperial holidays that meant nothing except additional inspections and lengthened prayer services. The crew quarters were designed for a complement of 3,000 souls, but we operated with nearly 5,000 after absorbing survivors from 3 other vessels that had been lost to warp storms, pirate raids, and one incident that was never fully explained involving an entire deck that had to be sealed and purged of atmosphere. The overcrowding meant sleeping in shifts within the same bunks, your body warming sheets still damp with another man's sweat, your dreams interrupted by the next shift crawling into the space you just vacated. Privacy was a concept that lost meaning after the first month. Dignity followed soon after. You learned to perform bodily functions in communal facilities that reeked of chemical cleaners and despair. Learn to wash yourself in tepid water rationed to 30 seconds per day. Learn to eat processed protein paste that tasted of nothing and left you simultaneously full and hungry. The officers fared better, but not by much. I shared a cabin meant for one with Lieutenant Corvin, a gunnery officer who had served aboard for 16 years and had developed a facial tic that manifested whenever the ship was not in active engagement. He would lie in his bunk during sleep periods with his eyes open, staring at the ceiling and making small adjustments to imaginary firing solutions with twitching fingers. He never spoke about his life before the wrath. No one did. To speak of anything beyond the ship was to acknowledge that such places still existed, and that acknowledgement bred discontent. My duties as 6th officer encompassed everything the command staff deemed too tedious for their personal attention and too important to delegate entirely to ratings. I oversaw supply distribution, which meant calculating how to stretch insufficient rations across too many mouths, while ensuring that officers received their full portions and that the command deck never went without. I reviewed disciplinary reports, signing off on punishments that ranged from reduced rations to flogging to execution by spacing. I inspected maintenance crews and filed reports that documented deteriorating conditions everyone already knew about, but no one had resources to fix. The first execution I witnessed occurred 3 months into my service aboard the Wrath. A rating from the lower engineering decks had been caught hoarding food, secreting away portions of his already meager rations to create a small reserve. The quantity involved was perhaps 3 days' worth of protein paste. The offense was classified as theft from the Emperor's stores, a capital crime according to ship's regulations. The entire crew was mustered in the main assembly hall to witness justice being carried out. The rating was perhaps 19 standard years old. His face still soft with youth that shipboard life had not yet carved away. He stood at attention in the center of the deck as Captain Mordecai read the charges, his voice amplified through voxcasters that made the proceedings feel ceremonial, ritualized. The boy said nothing in his defense. There was nothing to say. He had been caught with evidence that could not be disputed. His crime was real, even if the reasons behind it were understandable to anyone who had felt hunger gnawing at their insides during the hours between meal rations. The captain explained to the assembled crew that mercy was the province of the weak, that compassion for the individual endangered the whole, that the Emperor's justice was absolute and without exception. He reminded us that we were soldiers in an eternal war, that our enemies would show us no quarter, and that we must therefore maintain the same unyielding discipline among ourselves. He spoke of faith and duty and the glory of sacrifice, his reconstructed face expressionless as servitors brought the rating before the starboard airlock. They stripped him of his uniform, leaving him in thin undergarments that offered no protection against the void. They bound his hands behind his back with wire that cut into his wrists hard enough to draw blood. They shoved him into the airlock chamber and sealed the inner door. Through the small armor-glass viewport I could see his face, still showing no expression, as though he had already accepted that this moment had been inevitable from the instant he decided to save those scraps of food. The captain activated the exterior door himself, pressing the release rune with ceremonial deliberation. The air rushed out in a violent exhalation that pulled the rating toward the stars. For 3 seconds he was visible through the viewport, his body convulsing as his lungs emptied and his blood began to boil. Then he tumbled away into the darkness and was gone, another piece of debris floating in the infinite nothing between worlds. The crew was dismissed. We returned to our stations. Work continued without pause. I vomited in a waste reclamation unit and reported for my next shift on time. The executions became more frequent as the months accumulated into years, As the promised rotation back to port failed to materialize and the deployment extended from 5 years to 10 to 15 to an open-ended patrol that was classified as essential to the sector's security. The reasons varied, but the outcome was always the same: a rating caught sleeping on watch, a servitor operator who failed to perform proper maintenance rituals, a tech priest who questioned whether certain failing systems could be safely operated. Each offense was presented as a threat to the entire vessel, each punishment justified as necessary for the survival of the whole. Captain Mordecai developed a system he called voluntary sacrifice, a practice he claimed was inspired by ancient Terran naval traditions. When supplies ran particularly low or when the ship suffered damage that required resource-intensive repairs, he would request volunteers to reduce their own rations or work additional shifts or submit to dangerous repair operations that had high casualty rates. Those who volunteered were praised as exemplars of Imperial faith. Those who did not volunteer were noted in records that could be reviewed during future disciplinary proceedings. The system was voluntary in name only. Everyone understood that refusing to volunteer marked you as suspect, as someone whose faith might be questioned, whose loyalty might require testing. So men volunteered to starve themselves. They volunteered to work until exhaustion caused them to make fatal mistakes. They volunteered to enter breached compartments without proper safety equipment because the equipment did not exist and the repairs could not wait. Lieutenant Corvin volunteered for everything. He took on extra shifts until he was working 18 hours out of every 24. He reduced his rations until his uniform hung loose on a frame that had become skeletal. He insisted on personally overseeing gunnery operations during engagements that required him to remain at his station for days at a time without sleep. His facial tic worsened until the left side of his face was in constant motion, twitching and spasming like a servitor with damaged neural connections. I asked him once why he pushed himself so relentlessly. We were in our shared cabin during a rare moment when both of us were off duty at the same time. He was lying in his bunk, staring at the ceiling, fingers making those small adjustments to invisible controls. He did not look at me when he answered. He said that stopping was the same as admitting defeat, that the moment you allowed yourself to rest was the moment you acknowledged that what was happening was not sustainable, and that acknowledgement would break you more surely than any amount of exhaustion. He said that faith required constant renewal, that if you did not actively demonstrate your devotion every hour of every day, then doubt would creep in through the gaps. He said that he had seen what happened to men who allowed themselves to think too much about their circumstances, who let themselves remember that life could be different than this. He said they all died badly. The indomitable Wrath encountered its first major engagement during my second year aboard, a skirmish with what Fleet Command classified as renegade raiders operating out of an uncharted asteroid field. The raiders were fast-moving frigates that harried our flanks and forced us into evasive maneuvers that pushed the ancient plasma drives beyond their recommended operational parameters. The engagement lasted 6 hours and left us with moderate hull damage, 14 casualties from a direct hit on one of the crew decks, and an ammunition expenditure that would not be replenished for another 8 months. Captain Mordecai declared it a glorious victory. He held a ceremony in the main assembly hall where he commended the crew's bravery and reaffirmed our sacred duty to purge the Emperor's enemies from the void. He promoted 3 ratings to positions that had been left vacant by the dead. He reduced rations across the entire ship to compensate for the food stores destroyed in the attack, framing this as a temporary measure that would demonstrate our collective dedication to efficiency and shared sacrifice. The reduced rations never returned to normal levels. 8 months later, when the supply ship finally arrived with ammunition, it carried no food beyond basic nutritional supplements that prevented outright starvation but provided no sense of fullness. The supply officer, a bureaucrat who had likely never spent more than a few days in the void, explained that priority had been given to ordnance because the sector was experiencing increased hostile activity and properly armed warships were deemed more valuable than well-fed crews. We accepted this explanation because we had no choice. We ate our reduced rations and performed our duties and pretended that the hunger gnawing at us was a form of penance that brought us closer to the Emperor's grace. Some among the crew began to believe it. I watched men thank the officers for the privilege of their suffering, praising the captain's wisdom in allowing them to demonstrate their faith through physical deprivation. I watched them volunteer for increasingly dangerous duties and describe their service in terms of religious ecstasy, as though pain and exhaustion were forms of communion with the divine. Lieutenant Corven was among them. He began attending prayer services that were not mandatory, spending hours in the small chapel, maintained by the ship's confessor, reciting litanies and flagellating himself with wire flails until his back was a mass of scars. He spoke less and less until entire days would pass without him uttering a word. His performance during combat operations remained flawless, his gunnery crews achieving hit rates that exceeded those of any other division, but the man who achieved those results was increasingly absent from his own flesh. I did not follow him down that path. I am not certain why. Perhaps it was cowardice, an inability to surrender completely to faith's demands. Perhaps it was stubbornness, some small core of self that refused to be dissolved in duty's acid. Or perhaps it was simply that I had seen too much to believe that our suffering served any divine purpose, that I understood on some level that what was happening aboard the indomitable Wrath was not the Emperor's will but the consequence of a logistical system so vast and indifferent that we were less than footnotes in its calculations. The ship continued its patrol through sectors that were nominally under Imperial control but in practice were lawless regions where pirate fleets operated with impunity and minor Xenos incursions went unopposed for years. We responded to distress calls from colonies that were already burning when we arrived. We escorted merchant convoys through transit routes where more than half the vessels were lost to raiders or warp storms. We engaged in boarding actions against vessels that fought with desperate savagery because they knew surrender meant execution. Each engagement depleted our resources further. Each victory was Pyrrhic, purchased with casualties we could not replace and ammunition we could not replenish. The indomitable Wrath was slowly being consumed by its own purpose, grinding itself down in service of an Imperium that seemed to have forgotten we existed. The communications we received from Fleet Command became increasingly sparse and contradictory. We were ordered to hold sectors that were simultaneously being abandoned by other Imperial forces. We were instructed to await reinforcements that never arrived. We were assigned patrol routes that took us further from established supply lines and deeper into regions where the warp's influence made reliable navigation nearly impossible. During my 5th year aboard, we went 11 months without receiving any communication from outside the ship. The astropathic choir fell silent after the primary psyker suffered a catastrophic seizure that left her a drooling shell. The secondary psyker attempted to maintain contact, but lacked the power to reach through the warp storms that seemed to be intensifying throughout the sector. We continued our patrol because no one had ordered us to stop, following routes that had been established years ago and were likely obsolete. The isolation transformed the crew's psychology. Without external communication, the ship became its own reality, a self-contained universe where the only truths were those spoken by the captain and his officers. The outside Imperium became almost mythological, a distant concept that held less reality than the bulkheads and deck plates that formed the boundaries of our existence. Some among the crew began to question whether the Imperium still existed, whether perhaps some catastrophe had befallen humanity and we were the last loyal servants of an emperor who might himself be dead. Such talk was sedition, of course. Those who voiced these thoughts too openly found themselves facing disciplinary proceedings. But the thoughts persisted, spreading through the crew like a virus that could not be purged because it lived in the spaces between words, in the glances exchanged during prayer services, in the dreams men did not speak about when they woke. Captain Mordecai responded to this crisis of faith with intensified religious observance. Prayer services were extended and made mandatory for all crew, not on critical duty stations. The ship's confessor, a withered man whose augmetic eyes glowed with sickly green light, began conducting daily inspections where crew members were required to recite the Litany of Duty while he searched their quarters for contraband or evidence of heretical thought. Those found wanting were subjected to punishments that escalated from reduced rations to physical mortification to public confession sessions where they were forced to describe their spiritual failings in excruciating detail. The terror was more effective than any reasoned argument could have been. The questioning stopped, or at least went underground where it could not contaminate others. The crew returned to their duties with renewed fervor, as though by working harder they could stave off the doubts that gnawed at them. Productivity increased even as physical capacity declined. Men worked until they collapsed and then worked through the collapse, pushing bodies that should have failed past any reasonable limit through sheer force of will and fear of what would happen if they stopped. I was promoted to 4th officer during this period, elevated to fill a position left vacant when Lieutenant Commander Thesic was discovered to have been falsifying supply reports to cover the fact that he had been providing extra rations to his own division. The evidence was discovered during a routine audit that was anything but routine, a targeted investigation that everyone understood had been initiated to find exactly what it found. Thesic was spaced without trial. His division was interrogated individually, and 3 ratings who admitted to accepting the extra rations were flogged in the main assembly hall. The promotion came with additional responsibilities and slightly better quarters, a cabin I shared with only 1 other officer instead of 2. It also came with deeper involvement in the command structure, access to information that had previously been above my clearance level. I learned that our patrol had been extended indefinitely, not because we were essential to sector security, but because the fleet simply had nowhere else to send us. I learned that half the supply requests we had filed over the years had never reached their destinations, lost in bureaucratic labyrinths, or simply ignored because other vessels had higher priority. I learned that the Indomitable Wrath had been written off as a strategic loss 3 years ago, classified as unlikely to return from its deployment, and therefore not worth the resource investment of maintaining or recalling. We were effectively ghosts, dead men operating a ship that existed in official records but not in operational planning. This knowledge should have broken me. Instead, it clarified things. I understood then that what we were doing had nothing to do with faith or duty or the Emperor's will. We were simply momentum, a vessel that continued moving because stopping required resources and attention no one was willing to provide. Every sacrifice made aboard this ship, every execution and punishment and voluntary deprivation served no purpose except to maintain a fiction that what we were doing mattered. The revelation freed me in ways I had not expected. If nothing we did mattered, then I was free to focus purely on survival, my own, and that of whoever I could protect. The higher ideals that had sustained me through the early years fell away like dead skin, leaving something harder and more pragmatic beneath. I became efficient in ways that earlier version of myself would have considered cruel. I made decisions based on cold calculation rather than sentiment. I learned to see crew members as resources to be allocated rather than individuals with hopes and fears. Captain Mordecai noticed the change. He began assigning me to the most unpleasant duties, tasks that required what he called moral strength. I oversaw punishment details, ensuring that floggings were carried out with proper severity. I selected volunteers for hazardous operations based on who could be most easily spared. I conducted interviews with crew members suspected of harboring seditious thoughts and wrote reports that sealed their fates. I did these things because refusing would have marked me as unreliable, because the alternative was to become the subject of those same investigations. I did them because I had learned that the middle ranks were the most dangerous place to exist aboard a vessel like this, too senior to hide among the masses, but too junior to shape policy. Survival required proving myself useful to those above, while maintaining sufficient distance from those below. Lieutenant Corvin died during my 8th year aboard, though his death was not officially recorded as such. He had volunteered to personally oversee repairs to one of the main gun batteries after we suffered damage during an engagement with what Fleet Command classified as a minor Xenos incursion. The repairs required working inside the gun housing while the ship was still in combat, making micro-adjustments to targeting systems that had been damaged by enemy fire. The gun fired while he was still inside it, a consequence of either miscommunication between decks or malfunction in the firing control systems. The result was the same either way. Lieutenant Corvin was vaporized instantly, his body reduced to constituent atoms in the microsecond between the capacitors discharging and the projectile leaving the barrel. There was nothing left to space, no remains to speak prayers over. The official report listed him as killed in action, a hero who had died ensuring the Emperor's wrath found its mark. His name was added to the Roll of Honor displayed in the main assembly hall. His personal effects, which consisted of a worn prayer book and 3 sets of uniforms, were distributed to ratings who could use them. His bunk was assigned to another officer within the same day. I felt nothing when I heard about his death. This absence of feeling disturbed me more than grief would have. I had shared quarters with the man for 8 years, had watched him slowly transform from a competent officer into something that was more servitor than human, and his passing provoked no emotional response beyond mild inconvenience that I would need to acclimate to a new cabin mate. The numbness was pervasive. I watched men die and felt nothing. I issued orders that sent crews into situations with low survival chances and felt nothing. I ate my reduced rations and performed my duties and slept in my assigned hours and felt nothing beyond a distant awareness that I was still functioning, that the biological processes that sustained life continued even though the thing inhabiting that life was increasingly hollow. The ship's confessor summoned me to his quarters during my 9th year, a cramped space filled with religious iconography and the smell of incense that barely masked the underlying rot. His augmetic eyes fixed on me with unsettling intensity as he asked whether I had been maintaining proper spiritual hygiene, whether I attended to my prayers with appropriate devotion, whether I felt the Emperor's presence in my daily service. I told him what he wanted to hear, reciting the expected platitudes with sufficient conviction to satisfy his assessment. He watched me throughout with an expression I could not read, his mechanical eyes clicking and whirring as they adjusted focus. When I finished, he nodded slowly and told me that faith was not a feeling but an action, that emotions were irrelevant compared to the continued performance of duty. He said that many of the most faithful among the Imperium's servants felt nothing at all, that they had burned away the weakness of sentiment until only pure function remained. He said that this was not a failure of spirit, but an achievement, a state of grace that allowed them to serve without the distractions of conscience or compassion. He said that I was well on my way to becoming the kind of officer the Emperor needed. I thanked him for his guidance and left his quarters with a cold certainty that I had been marked as either a model to emulate or a problem to eliminate. The distinction was unclear and perhaps did not matter. Both possibilities led to the same conclusion, the same narrow path between absolute obedience and total destruction. The indomitable wrath continued its patrol through regions that seemed to be actively deteriorating, sectors where Imperial control existed only in theory while the reality was chaos and constant conflict. We engaged hostile forces with increasing frequency, minor skirmishes that depleted our ammunition and wore down our systems without ever achieving anything resembling victory. The enemies we fought were often as desperate as we were, pirates and renegades operating with stolen Imperial vessels that were in similar states of decay. During one engagement, we faced a frigate that had once been part of the Imperial Navy, its hull still bearing the Aquila even though the crew had turned to piracy years ago. The battle was brief and brutal, ending when our superior firepower overwhelmed their failing shields and reduced their vessel to debris. We picked up no survivors. We did not attempt to salvage any of their supplies. We simply recorded the engagement as another victory and continued on our patrol route. The pattern repeated itself with variations that made no meaningful difference. We fought. We survived. We depleted ourselves further. The gaps in our crew roster grew as casualties accumulated faster than we could promote replacements from the ratings. Junior officers were elevated to positions they were unprepared for, learning their duties through trial and error that often proved fatal. Senior officers developed the 1,000-yard stare common to those who had seen too much combat, their eyes focusing on distant points that existed somewhere beyond the bulkheads. Captain Mordecai aged rapidly during these years, his reconstructed face growing more asymmetrical as the biological portions sagged while the augmetic components remained fixed. His speeches became longer and more frenzied, filled with references to ancient battles and legendary heroes whose sacrifices had ensured the Imperium's survival. He spoke of duty as though it were a physical substance that could be measured and weighed, as though by accumulating enough of it we could transform our situation through sheer force of faith. No one believed him anymore. We went through the motions because stopping required more energy than continuing, because the alternative to following orders was chaos that would kill us faster than enemy fire. The faith that had sustained the early years of the deployment had been replaced by something colder and more mechanical, a form of discipline that had no spiritual component but operated with perfect efficiency. I was promoted to 3rd officer during my 11th year aboard, another elevation to fill a gap left by death. 2nd officer during my 13th year, 1st officer during my 16th. Each promotion brought more responsibility and less rest, deeper involvement in decisions that sent men to their deaths, and greater awareness of how thoroughly we had been abandoned by the Imperium we served. The command staff consisted by this point of Captain Mordecai, myself, and 3 junior officers who rotated through positions faster than I could learn their names. We held daily briefings in the captain's quarters, where we reviewed patrol routes and supply status and casualty reports with the detached efficiency of men discussing weather patterns. The captain still spoke of duty and faith, but his words had become ritualized, empty sounds that filled silence without conveying meaning. The ship itself was failing in ways that could no longer be hidden or explained away. Entire decks had been sealed after life support failures, their atmospheres vented to preserve resources for sections that could still be maintained. The crew complement had been reduced through attrition from 5,000 to less than 2,000, and those who remained were hollow-eyed survivors who performed their duties with mechanical precision. The tech priests had given up trying to maintain systems properly and instead performed constant triage, keeping the most critical functions operating while allowing everything else to degrade. The plasma drives ran at dangerous overload levels constantly because the alternative was being unable to maneuver during combat. The void shields flickered and failed with increasing frequency because the generators were wearing out and we had no replacements. The weapons batteries were down to half capacity because ammunition was scarce and many of the guns had simply worn out from use. We were a wreck held together by desperation and the inability to do anything else. The communications finally resumed during my 18th year aboard, a garbled transmission that took the remaining astropath 3 days to pass into coherent orders. Fleet Command was redirecting us to rendezvous with a convoy traveling through a contested system where we would provide escort for a battle barge transporting troops to a conflict zone. The orders included updated intelligence on enemy activity in the region and a warning that hostile forces had been interdicting supply routes with increasing effectiveness. The orders also included our first scheduled port rotation in 2 decades, a promise that after completing the escort duty we would return to Baca Orbital for refit and crew exchange. The notification was almost casual, a single line buried in paragraphs of tactical information, as though someone had suddenly remembered that we existed and decided to include us in normal fleet operations. Captain Mordecai addressed the crew over the ship-wide vox, his voice carrying a manic energy I had not heard in years. He spoke of redemption and vindication, of how our long service was finally being recognized, of how we would soon rest and rearm and return to the fight with renewed strength. He declared a day of celebration where double rations would be distributed and mandatory prayer services would focus on thanksgiving rather than penitence. The crew received this news with reactions that ranged from cautious hope to complete apathy. Those who had been aboard since the beginning of the deployment barely responded, too worn down to believe in anything beyond their immediate circumstances. The relative newcomers, those who had come aboard within the last 5 or 6 years, showed more enthusiasm, clinging to the promise of shore leave as proof that their service had an endpoint. I felt nothing. The promise of port rotation seemed abstract, a future possibility that had no connection to the present reality. We still had to complete the escort mission. We still had to survive whatever engagement awaited us in the contested system. The indomitable Wrath was barely functional, its crew decimated, its systems failing. The chances that we would reach port were minimal at best. But orders were orders. We adjusted our course and burned toward the rendezvous coordinates at best speed, pushing the plasma drives until the tech priests warned that catastrophic failure was becoming probable. The journey took 3 weeks. 3 weeks of relative calm, where nothing broke catastrophically and no hostile forces appeared to challenge us. The crew used this time to perform what maintenance they could, to catch up on sleep they had been missing for years, to dare to imagine that perhaps this deployment truly was ending. The convoy appeared on our sensors exactly when and where the orders indicated it would be, a collection of 30 transport vessels protected by a battle barge and 2 destroyers. The battle barge was the Righteous Fury, a vessel of the Imperial Fists chapter, its hull painted in the yellow and black that marked it as a bearer of one of the Imperium's most sacred lineages. The sight of it on our viewing screens provoked reactions from the crew that ranged from awe to resentment. Acknowledgement that we were in the presence of something holy mixed with bitterness at how thoroughly we had been forgotten while these chosen warriors received every resource and honor. We took up our assigned position on the convoy's flank and began the transit through the contested system, a journey that should have taken perhaps 4 days if conditions remained stable. The system was a dense cluster of asteroid fields and failed planets, natural cover for raiders and pirates who had been preying on Imperial shipping for years. The intelligence briefing indicated that hostile forces were known to operate in the region but were considered minor threats that a properly escorted convoy could handle without difficulty. The first attack came on the second day, a probing assault by fast-moving raiders that tested our response times and withdrew before we could bring significant firepower to bear. The Righteous Fury's weapons demolished 2 of the attackers with ease, its massive guns speaking with authority that our own depleted batteries could not match. The remaining raiders scattered into the asteroid fields and vanished from our sensors. Captain Mordecai declared it a successful defense and commended the crew's performance during the brief engagement. We had fired perhaps a dozen shots total, most of which missed because our targeting systems were not properly calibrated, but the presence of the battle barge made our contribution irrelevant. We were there to show additional ships on sensors to make the convoy appear more heavily defended than it actually was. The second attack came 6 hours later with greater force and coordination. 15 hostile vessels emerged from behind a large asteroid and moved to cut off the convoy's path, forcing us into a formation that limited our maneuverability. The battle barge moved to engage while the destroyers attempted to keep the raiders away from the transport vessels. The indomitable Wrath was ordered to hold position and provide supporting fire, a task we attempted with limited effectiveness given our degraded weapon systems. The engagement lasted 3 hours and resulted in the destruction of 9 hostile vessels at the cost of 2 transports and significant damage to one of the destroyers. The Righteous Fury emerged unscathed, its void shields barely stressed by the level of firepower the raiders could bring to bear. We lost a weapons battery when a lucky shot penetrated our failing shields and detonated against the hull, killing 17 crew members and forcing us to seal off an entire section to prevent atmosphere loss. Captain Mordecai again declared victory, though his voice over the Vox carried an edge of desperation that had not been present after the first engagement. We continued on our course with the convoy now more tightly grouped, the transports clustering close to the battle barge while we maintained our assigned position on the flank. The third attack came as we were preparing to exit the system, a full-scale assault by hostile forces that had been gathering while we fought off the earlier probes. 40 vessels appeared on our sensors, a mixed fleet of raiders, renegade naval ships, and something larger that the sensor operators initially could not classify. The battle barge immediately moved to interpose itself between the hostile fleet and the transports, its guns already firing at maximum range. Fleet Command transmitted new orders through the astropathic choir, instructions that were horrifyingly clear despite the warp's interference. The Righteous Fury and its cargo of Space Marines were considered strategically essential, resources that could not be risked in extended combat. The transports carried equipment and personnel necessary for an ongoing campaign that had higher priority than this convoy. The destroyers were to escort them out of the system immediately, using whatever path offered least resistance. The indomitable Wrath was ordered to hold position and delay the hostile fleet for as long as possible, to buy time for the convoy to escape by drawing enemy attention and absorbing fire that would otherwise threaten the more valuable vessels. We were being ordered to die. Captain Mordecai received these orders in silence, his reconstructed face showing no expression as he read the transmission 3 times. The bridge crew waited for his response, the silence broken only by the background sounds of systems operating and distant impacts as the enemy fleet began to engage. He looked up from the orders and his eyes met mine, and in that moment I saw something I had not seen in years. Genuine human emotion, specifically the terrible clarity that comes when all pretense falls away and you are faced with an absolutely simple choice. He could refuse the orders and attempt to withdraw with the convoy, sacrificing his honor and likely ensuring that we were fired upon by our own forces. He could follow the orders and lead us all to certain death in the name of duty, or he could find some third path that preserved both life and loyalty, though what that path might be was unclear given our circumstances. He ordered us to hold position and prepare for engagement. The hostile fleet closed on our position with the single-minded focus of predators who had identified the weakest target. The battle barge and its escort were already burning away at maximum acceleration, their void shields flashing as they deflected fire from the few enemy vessels that attempted to pursue. The main force of the hostile fleet was coming directly at us, 40 ships against our single damaged cruiser. The captain ordered all weapons batteries to begin firing at maximum rate, ordered the remaining shields brought to full power, ordered all non-essential crew to abandon their stations and seal themselves in the most protected sections of the ship. His voice over the Vox was calm and measured, as though he were conducting a routine patrol exercise rather than ordering us to fight a battle we could not possibly win. I took my position at the tactical station and began coordinating the defense, allocating our failing shields to cover the most critical systems and attempting to optimize our limited weapons fire for maximum effect. The first officer, a young man named Torvin who had been promoted just 3 months ago, stood at the helm and made small adjustments to our position that kept us between the enemy fleet and the fleeing convoy. The initial exchange lasted perhaps 30 seconds. Our weapons found their marks on several enemy vessels, damaging 2 and destroying 1 that had already been compromised by earlier fighting. Their return fire struck our shields and overloaded them almost immediately, the generators burning out from the strain and leaving our hull exposed to direct hits. The ship shuddered as impacts walked across our starboard side, breaching compartments and killing crew members who had remained at their stations. The captain ordered us to continue firing, to maintain position no matter what damage we sustained. The weapons crews obeyed with a mechanical efficiency that had become second nature after years of endless drills. The guns spoke with their remaining voice, hurling shells and energy blasts into the enemy fleet, with diminishing effect as systems failed and ammunition ran low. A direct hit on our dorsal section destroyed one of the main battery clusters and killed everyone stationed there. Another impact breached the port side and vented 3 decks to space. A third hit struck near the bridge and sent us reeling, the lights flickering and failing before emergency illumination kicked in with sickly red glow. Through it all, the captain stood at his station, his voice continuing to issue orders with the same measured calm. He commended crews for their performance. He noted with satisfaction as our fire found targets. He quoted from the litanies of battle and spoke of the Emperor's grace falling upon those who served with faithful hearts. The enemy fleet began to break away after 8 minutes of sustained combat, their attention shifting toward the fleeing convoy as they realized we were effectively dead already. Their fire slackened as they turned to pursue more valuable targets, leaving us drifting with failing systems and hundreds of dead crew members. The captain ordered all hands to damage control, to seal breaches and restore what systems could be restored. The assessment that came back over the next hour painted a picture of a vessel that should have been abandoned, that was by any reasonable metric no longer capable of sustained operation. Our weapons were down to 30% capacity. Our engines were operating at minimal function. Our life support was failing in 2/3 of the ship. Our crew complement had been reduced by more than half in less than 10 minutes of combat. But we were still moving, still technically capable of firing a gun, still following our orders to delay the enemy fleet. The hostile ships returned after pursuing the convoy for 20 minutes, apparently deciding that finishing us off was worth the time investment. They came at us with casual confidence, no longer bothering with coordination or tactics because we posed no meaningful threat. They simply closed to optimal firing range and began methodically destroying what remained of our vessel. The captain ordered us to continue firing as long as we had guns that could fire. The weapons crews who remained alive obeyed, sending out a last few defiant shots before the batteries failed completely. The enemy response was overwhelming and final, impacts that tore through our already compromised hull and reached deep into the ship's vital systems. The plasma drives failed first, their magnetic containment collapsing and sending a surge of energy through the power conduits that fried systems throughout the vessel. The lights died completely. The artificial gravity stuttered and went out, leaving us floating in the darkness. The Vox network fell silent, except for emergency channels that ran on backup power. In that darkness, I heard Captain Mordecai's voice, one last time, transmitted through a handheld Vox unit that still functioned. He was reciting the litany of final duty, the prayer meant for those who knew they were about to die in the Emperor's service. His voice was steady and clear, showing none of the desperation or fear that must have gripped him. He reached the end of the litany, and then there was silence. The enemy fleet departed, their sensors likely indicating that we were no longer a functional vessel and therefore not worth additional ammunition. They left us drifting in the debris field that had been our patrol sector, a broken hull filled with the dead and dying, still technically following our orders because we had not been given permission to stop. I do not know how long I drifted in that darkness. Time lost meaning when measured only by the failing of life support and the gradual cooling of the ship. I was trapped in the command center by debris that had collapsed when the artificial gravity failed, pinned but not crushed, able to breathe the thinning air but unable to move. The rescue, when it came, was almost an afterthought. A patrol ship investigating debris from the battle detected our emergency beacon and approached cautiously, its crew probably expecting to find only corpses. They cut through the wreckage and extracted survivors, 27 souls out of the 2,000 who had been aboard when the engagement began. I was among them. I learned later that the convoy had escaped successfully, that the Space Marines and their essential cargo had reached their destination and been deployed as planned. The battle that followed was classified as a major victory, a turning point in some campaign I had never heard of. The indomitable Wrath sacrifice was noted in official reports as having been instrumental in ensuring this success. Captain Mordecai was posthumously awarded commendations for his faithful service. His name was added to rolls of honor. His sacrifice was held up as an example of the kind of devotion the Emperor expected from his servants. I was promoted to captain and given command of a newly refitted light cruiser, along with a crew composed largely of survivors from other vessels that had been lost in similar circumstances. The ship was christened the Unyielding Dawn, and I was ordered to take her on patrol through the same sectors the indomitable Wrath had covered, continuing the mission that had never officially ended. I accepted the promotion because refusing was not an option. I took command of the new vessel and began the familiar routine of managing supplies and disciplinary proceedings and endless patrol routes through regions where Imperial control was nominal at best. The crew looked to me for leadership, and I provided it with the same cold efficiency I had learned aboard the Wrath, making decisions based on what would keep us functional rather than what might be right or merciful. I have been commanding the Unyielding Dawn for 5 years now, We have fought 17 engagements and lost 300 crew members. We have not been to port once. Our deployment has been extended indefinitely due to operational necessities that are never fully explained. I issue orders that send men to their deaths, and I feel nothing. I sign off on executions for minor infractions, and I feel nothing. I lie to my crew about shore leave and relief and the value of their sacrifice, and I feel nothing. The numbness that began aboard the Indomitable Wrath has become complete. There is no Reth Varos anymore, just the shell that performs the duties expected of an Imperial Navy captain. I am efficient. I am obedient. I am faithful in the only way that matters, which is to say that I continue to function regardless of circumstances. The Emperor protects, or so we tell ourselves. In truth, the Emperor asks only that we continue, that we maintain position and follow orders and die when required without complaint or hesitation. Faith is not belief but action. Duty is not choice but inevitability. We are not individuals but components in a machine so vast that our deaths are less than rounding errors in calculations we will never understand. I stand on the bridge of the unyielding dawn and watch the stars drift past the viewports, the same stars that surrounded the Indomitable Wrath on its endless patrol. My crew goes about their duties with the mechanical precision that comes from knowing that efficiency is survival. My officers issue orders that I approve without thought because the decisions are obvious and inevitable. The ship continues on its route because no one has ordered it to stop. This is the reality of Imperial Navy service, the truth that lies beneath the propaganda and the glory in the speeches about duty. We are ghosts, dead men operating dead ships, continuing to move through space because stopping would require energy no one is willing to expend. We fight battles that achieve nothing except our own continued existence. We make sacrifices that serve no purpose except to demonstrate that we are capable of sacrifice. I could have refused the orders aboard the Indomitable Wrath. I could have counseled the captain to withdraw, to prioritize our survival over our mission. I could have mutinied when he chose to hold position, could have tried to save the men who died in those 8 minutes of pointless combat. I did nothing. I followed orders. I survived. And now I am the one giving orders that will kill other men, perpetuating the same system that ground me down to nothing. I am the captain now, the authority figure who speaks of duty and faith and the Emperor's will. I am everything I watched destroy Lieutenant Corvin and Captain Mordecai and thousands of others whose names I no longer remember. The void presses against the hull with patient hunger, waiting for the inevitable failures that will let it in. The darkness between stars is not empty but filled with the accumulated weight of all those who have died in service, their atoms dispersed into the eternal nothing. We join them piece by piece, giving up fragments of humanity with every order followed, and every sacrifice made until nothing remains but the machinery of obedience. This is what the Imperium asks of its servants. Not heroism, not glory, just the ability to continue functioning long after any reasonable person would have given up, to maintain discipline when discipline has become indistinguishable from suicide, to believe in a purpose that exists only because we agree to pretend it does. The stars continue their slow drift across the viewports. The ship continues its patrol. The crew continues to follow orders, and I continue to command them, a hollow man leading broken souls through an infinite darkness, faithful in the only way that matters, which is to say that I have not yet stopped moving. The unyielding dawn will patrol until it can no longer patrol. I will command until I can no longer command. The crew will serve until they can no longer serve. And when we finally fail, when the systems give out completely and the void claims what remains, some other vessel will take our place on the patrol routes. Some other captain will give the same orders. Some other crew will follow them with the same mechanical obedience. This is the broken life of the Imperial Navy. This is what it means to serve in the eternal war. Not the glory of righteous combat, but the grinding attrition of endurance without purpose, sacrifice without meaning, death without honor. We are the forgotten, the expended, the lost. We are the men who continue to fight long after the Imperium has stopped paying attention, who follow orders that no longer make sense because the alternative is chaos we cannot survive. We are the proof that faith requires no divine presence, only the inability to imagine any other way of existing. The Emperor protects, or so we tell ourselves, in the moments before sleep claims us, in the seconds before battle is joined, in the final instant before the void rushes in. The Emperor protects by asking nothing except our lives, our sanity, our souls, everything we are and everything we might have been, offered up on the altar of a purpose too vast to question and too terrible to truly believe. I stand on my bridge and watch the stars and wait for the orders that will eventually kill us all. I am faithful, I am obedient, I am empty. I am the Imperial Navy.